And I also have 2 kids at Scottish Corners Elementary. PERC has been in existence for over 10 years and was started as an offshoot of the PTOs in Dublin City Schools. The volunteer group of parents, community members, and district representatives work to develop programming for the year that can benefit the Dublin community. In the past year, we've had a rebrand to a new name, an updated logo, and a website refresh. Our new name is Parents and Educators Raising a Community, but we're still known as PERC. With our new rebranding, we're very much hoping to diversify the representation of our group to ensure that we're hearing from our entire community when we plan programming. We want to make sure that all district voices are represented in our group, and we invite anybody from the district community who is interested to attend our monthly meetings held at 9:30 a.m. on the 3rd Wednesday of the month here at the Emerald campus. After the presentation, we encourage you to provide us some valuable feedback on ideas for future presentations by visiting the PERC website at dublinperc.org. The final 2 PERC events for the year will include a book talk on Wednesday, April the 6th at 9:30 a.m. and 7 p.m., where a Centero clinician will facilitate a discussion on Jessica Leahy's recent book, The Addiction Inoculation, Raising Healthy Kids in a Culture of Dependence. And additionally, there will be a program at Dublin Jerome High School on Thursday, April 6th, the next night, at 7 p.m. called Can You See Me Now?, where you can explore a simulated teen bedroom to explore potential warning signs of drug and alcohol use and risky behavior. So we hope you'll take a look at those. But today we are so excited to welcome Dr. Jess Shakken to Dublin on the eve of St. Patrick's Day, no less. He will also have a presentation tomorrow morning at the Dublin Rec Center in the Tallis Rooms at 9:30. If other folks want to join in person then, and we'll really have him on St. Patrick's Day. I heard he has a green suit, so he's going to fit in perfect. But we have been so excited to get him here. Dr. Shakken is a nationally recognized child and adolescent psychiatrist who's one of the country's foremost voices in child and adolescent mental health. He's a professor of child and adolescent psychiatry and pediatrics at the New York University School of Medicine. Dr. Shatkin is the author of Born to be Wild, Why Teens Take Risks, and How We Can Help Keep Them Safe. He brings more than 2 decades worth of research and clinical experience to the subject, along with cutting-edge findings from brain science, evolutionary psychology, game theory, and other disciplines, and from the perspective of a concerned dad himself. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Shakken.
All right, thanks everybody. Feel free to move up if you'd like, if I feel like I'm at a distance from you. How's that? We're back on, okay. Thanks for inviting me, happy to be here, and I hope this is helpful for you tonight. So I'm going to talk to you about managing high-risk behavior in kids, and since there's such an intimate audience, I think it would be great if anytime you have questions or comments that you just either speak up or raise your hand and I'll call on you. I'd love to hear what you have to say, and we can all learn from each other. So I have to give you my disclosures. That's the book on the left. There's another book here, which is a textbook. That's that one right there. You can't see it on the screen. And then I do a radio show on Fridays. Not this Friday, I'm out this way, but on Sirius XM's radio, Dr. Radio channel, and people call in and ask questions about their kids, and we have interviews and invite people out. And if you're ever in my area, please come by. So, all right, what I'm going to talk to you tonight about is first what risks adolescents take, and that's something that you probably already know and have a good idea about and may not need too much prompting, but we'll spend a moment on that. We'll then get into how adolescents think about risk, and I think that you'll find something new there. If you read the book that we're talking about tonight, you may not find something too new, but if you haven't, or if you have, maybe it'll be a refresher. But how adolescents think about risk is different than we used to think, and we've learned a lot in the last couple of decades about that. Why they engage in risky behavior is a whole can of worms filled with all sorts of neuroscience that is readily applicable to how they behave on a daily basis. So there's lots to talk about there. I will not go too deeply into that unless you want to, but I'll give you an overview of that. And I hope to accomplish those first 3 things in about 30-35 minutes, and then we'll spend the rest of our time briefly talking about how they make decisions and finally what we can do to make things safer and better for them. So that's the focus, but again, I'm happy to divert if that seems right to you. So I could ask for audience participation here, but I know that you're going to say driving. I know you're going to say drug use. I know you're going to say sexual activity, maybe unprotected sexual activity. I know you're going to say too much time on screens. I know you're going to say showing off for each other, you know, jumping off the wall of the reservoir into the water. Is there anything I'm missing that you're worried about? Those are the big things, right? So, all right, we all agree there. When you think about the risks you took, they were probably similar. And maybe you didn't take them, maybe a friend took them, right? I understand, you know, friends take risks. But, and good friends, don't let good friends take risks, and that's part of the message we can give our kids, because they can protect their friends, and that's one way to help prevent them from taking risk. But when you think about why it is that we take risk, it generally has to do with changes that occur in our brains and in our bodies around the time of puberty. Things change dramatically. I'll give you some numbers, but things really change from around the time we hit double digits, or puberty, until the time, I'm getting a little echo, so I'm going to bring this a little lower on my lapel here. Until the time that they are about 25, 26, things slow down at that point. Dramatically, there's a slowdown around 23, but it really tapers off over the next 5 or 6 years. We talk about adolescence now going from about the age of puberty until about 26. And if you like the brain science, we can even argue that that goes until 30. Whether you call it emerging adulthood or adolescence, it is a time of rapid change in the brain from at least around puberty until about 23 or 24. And the excitement is multifold, but the opportunities for risk are as well. So emotion changes in concert with that, our thinking changes, and the end result is we make behavioral changes and make decisions that we wouldn't have made before that result in the potential for risk. Now, the risks that our kids engage in, you know what they are. This isn't working anymore. There we go. Okay, 80% of high school students don't wear bicycle helmets. Okay, that's an obvious and easy one. But did you know that 1/3 of high school students don't wear motorcycle helmets? That's a real danger. I mean, bicycle helmets are dangerous enough, or bicycling without, but motorcycling in particular. In the past 30 days, 20% of high school students drove with someone who was drinking alcohol. 40% texted or emailed while they were driving. More than 35% of sophomores have had sex, more than 50% of juniors, and about 60% of seniors. So, you know, it's pretty normative to have sexual activity in high school. It doesn't mean that everybody's going to, but it's pretty typical too. So the good news is, you know, if you're not having sex in high school, there's still a lot of you who aren't having sex, but there are a lot who are. So it's you know, we have to reckon with that pretty plainly. We know that birth control works, and we know that 43% in the last, this is from the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, CDC run, good proportional sample. This is 2019. I didn't give you 20 and 21 data because it's COVID influenced and it's all different and not good and mostly not available. But 43% didn't use a condom last time they had sex. 14% didn't use any form of birth control, higher amongst minorities. 1 in 14 girls gets a sexually transmitted disease. 3 in 10 become pregnant, along with more than half of Latina teens in the US. So really high rates of these kind of behaviors and these kind of risks. And you know, getting pregnant is manageable, right? You can have the baby, you can abort the baby. There's lots of things you can do, but it's one of those things that sticks with people for a long time. So it's not something that you just sort of stop thinking about once it's over. 1 in 10 teen girls is physically forced to have intercourse. That number is about 11% in our country, so that's really high. That's remarkable, and something all fathers and mothers are concerned about. 1 in 4 seniors binge drank in the last 30 days. That's 5 or more drinks in 2 hours, along with more than 1 in 5 juniors and 1 in 6 sophomores. Over 1/4 of juniors and seniors smoked marijuana in the last month. So these things are out there. You know, it's prevalent. This is the kind of stuff we're talking about. I won't spend more time talking about that because we all know about these risks. This slide is worth looking at. I give you the data from 2013, not because things have changed, but because that was the year things really did change, and it stayed the same ever since. That was the year that suicide became the 2nd leading cause of death for people in this age group, 15 to 24. Actually, it's all the way up to 35. It's just that the percentage of deaths changes, so I just give you the sort of adolescent young adult numbers. But accident, suicide, and homicide in that order are the leading causes of death for people 15 to 35 years of age in our country. And if you look at this hotspot of adolescence, it's 85% of deaths. So again, this is the year 2013, 9 years ago, that suicide surpassed homicide. And most of those are gun deaths. Most of those are from access in some way to a lethal means. Accidents, about 1/3 are motor vehicle accidents, many of which are under the influence of substances. If you look worldwide, we don't get data on this every year, but this is the World Health Organization from a decade ago, and it's much the same thing. Road injury, suicide, interpersonal violence, which is homicide, 3 of the top 5, death, and then depression, alcohol, and anxiety, 3 of the top 5 in disability. So there are different considerations in the developing world, like antibiotic illnesses, bacterial illnesses, anemia, congenital HIV, things that are accounting for other high reasons of death that we don't have in the United States so much, or in most of the West. But you get the gist, that these are things that are happening because of how people are feeling, how they're thinking, and ultimately how they're behaving. If you look at mental health, we know a lot. I could give you a lot of information about this, but let me just suffice it to say that the more that we study mental illness, the higher rates we find amongst kids. Every generation since World War II, when we really started looking at this, we're seeing higher and higher rates. People sometimes say, what do you think about the epidemic of child mental illness? And I think there's no epidemic. An epidemic is something you don't expect. We've been expecting this for a long time. We've been seeing it grow every single generation, every single year that we track this, in fact. We see higher numbers. And so I think one of the most impressive studies is the little bullet point there that 49.5% of teenagers, based on our best proportional sample, national sample, met criteria for a psychiatric disorder. 26 or 28% for a severe disorder, 22% if you take out substance use disorders, which is what the SUDS is. So really high rates. 1 in 5 of our kids are having a severe psychiatric disorder. That's severe depression, that's severe obsessive compulsive disorder, that's severe ADHD and learning disorders that are really getting in the way of their functioning, that's early onset psychosis or bipolar disorder, it's post-traumatic stress disorder, big things that we really know can harm people. And when you look at good studies, and we've known this for 17 years now, you look at good studies of adults and you say, you have schizophrenia, you have bipolar disorder, you have depression, one of those big disorders, when did you first start experiencing symptoms that got in the way of your functioning? 50% said they experienced symptoms by the age of 14 and 75% by the age of 24. So there's a lot to do for us. This is what keeps people like me in business, and there's a lot of opportunity for us to intervene early, because we know when we intervene early, there's more that we can do and we can help prevent problems. How many of you have heard the phrase ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences? Most of you, many of you. So I won't go too much into this either, but we've known for about 20-some years that ACEs are these experiences that many of us have. In fact, 2/3 of adults have at least one ACE, and primary care doctors are now asking about this. When you go to the primary care doctor, were your parents divorced? Was anyone in your family incarcerated? Did anyone use substances? Did anybody have mental illness that was not well treated? Because those kind of adverse childhood experiences, of which there's about 14, add up. And the more you have, the more likely you are to not only have physical illness, which is why your primary care doctors are assessing it, but also, of course, mental illness. So rates of substance use, rates of hepatitis, rates of obesity, rates of hypertension, rates of depression, rates of suicidality go up immensely, and like hundreds of % higher if you have more ACEs. By the time you hit 3 or 4 ACEs, you've got a lot of risk factors. Now, none of these causes those things I'm talking about, but they're associated with it because these people have more burden to fight against. So there's a lot going on in childhood, again, that really matters. And arguably, in the last couple of decades, it's Vince Folletti's early ACE study from 98, 99 that is one of the most important, because it taught us that this is so prevalent, A, and that it really is enormously impactful. And this has been replicated many times. With all these stressors, with all of the things kids are dealing with all the brain changes and body changes we'll talk about in a minute, 30% of high school students felt sad or hopeless for 2 or more weeks in the past 12 months. That's 2 of the major criteria for depression. That's not saying 30% had major depression, but those are moving in the right direction. 18% say they seriously considered attempting suicide, and about 9% attempted suicide. So that's almost 10% of our kids. That's remarkable. Now it varies, and in a place like this, which I understand to be a well-supported, well-funded, and thoughtful school district, you may have a little bit less, but you may not. Things are generally worse where there's lower income, where there's poverty, where there's racism, where there's a lot of inequity, but not always. And these problems exist everywhere. And if you look at crime, just to sort of add that in, most criminal behavior happens in groups. Most criminal behavior happens before the age of 30, and half of all serious crimes are committed by teenagers. And that little bump in the graph there is just a birth cohort bump. So when you have more adolescents, as we did in the early mid-90s, we have more serious crime. So this is just another reason to be thinking about this. Kids engage in criminal behavior for lots of reasons, but part of it is just much more likely to happen at their age. This is me when I'm 16, and I had gone to Germany. I'd never been on a plane before. I was taking German in high school, And I liked German, and I liked what I was learning, and I was fascinated by it, and I went ahead and I got a chance to go for a summer and live with a family. And there were a couple other kids on this trip, and so we had these excursions, and this was one of these excursions. That was a new word I learned that summer, was excursion, and we went out to different castles, and we climbed castles. And here I am, I'm mugging for the camera, but I'm drinking 2 beers, sitting on the edge of a wall in a castle. We climbed, it seemed like a half a mile in the sky, but there was about a 100-foot drop behind me, and you can't see it there. But, you know, I think Freddie Mercury used to wear white jeans. I don't know where it was that I got white. I haven't worn white jeans probably since that day, but somehow I got white jeans. Anyway, I'm drinking those 2 beers, and, you know, it's not terribly dangerous, but a good swift wind or somebody bumping into me, and I could have died. And it's remarkable the things that you do to show off for your friends. And that's exactly what I was doing. And this is a picture to show you my 19-year-old son who took this picture in northern Hudson Valley of New York, near where we have a home. And he's sitting on the edge of about a 50-foot drop from where he is. It is about a quarter mile down to that river. But this is just the angle. It doesn't drop all the way down there from this one spot. But he took this picture, or his friends took a picture of him. And it's a dangerous spot to be in. And so this is just something, this is routine. He's a good kid. I was a good kid. I was a good student. He's a good student. He graduated with honors, you know, but we do these things. And for all the kids who don't have those other positive things in their life, they engage in a lot more of these behaviors. And if you read the book, I had plenty of mine. So how do adolescents assess risk? So let's talk about that. If you've read the book, you probably know, and I can play the game with you or not. But when you think about why adolescents engage in risk, what would you say? Like, what kind of things come to mind as to why people would do the things they do?
It feels good.
It feels good.
Relieve stress.
Relieve stress.
Exciting.
Say again?
It's exciting.
Exciting. Yeah, all good reasons, all real reasons.
They didn't have a plan to avoid it.
They didn't have a plan to avoid it. Yeah, right, so they weren't being mindful coming into the risk. So those are all good reasons, and I'm going to go through them in brief with you for the reasons that we understand, which over the last decade or two, now that we have these great tools, we can look inside the brain in a way we couldn't. We've made a lot of correlations and a lot of causal understanding about how the brain works, what happens with people, and why they engage in risk. Now, our old thoughts, and the thoughts that I was trained on, I went to medical school when I was 29, I was a little bit older, but it was in the 90s, and I was still taught when I hit my residency and fellowship in child psychiatry, that the reason people took risks, that kids took risks, was because they thought they were invincible. And that was a common explanation that people would give, and so I always like to start with this idea of not invincible. There aren't enough of us, and I didn't make you work that hard to come up with reasons, but eventually somebody would have said they think they're invincible, because that's what people say, because we all learned that. And whether it's low probability events like earthquakes and hurricanes, or whether it's higher probability events like accidents and pregnancy, kids always overestimate risk. They always think the risk is higher than it actually is. Go home and ask your child tonight, you know, what the risk of pregnancy is from unprotected intercourse. Ask them what the risk of HIV is if the man or the woman has HIV and the other one doesn't, or the man and the man, whatever you want to do. And you'll get these numbers that are remarkably high. Because they believe the risks are really high. Ask them if there's a chance that they'll die this year. This is a study of 15 and 16-year-olds. Oh, sorry, this is the sexually transmitted infection slide. Another great, juicy one. Between 6,000 and 60,000 times higher than the actual risk. Kids believe the risk of these things happening is enormous. This is the death bullet point, that if you ask 15 and 16-year-olds what the chance is that they will die this year, they will tell you the percent, and the number, I'm sorry, is 200 times higher than it actually is. And if they're a minority or if they're impoverished, they'll even say it's higher than that. Why do they think they're going to die? The chance that one of these kids is going to die is almost zero, but they give you these very highly inflated risks. The paradox of our risk programming, and much of what we've done so far when we talk about risk, and the reason I really wrote the book, because as I was starting to study this and develop programs, I started to realize that most of our programs actually focus on teaching kids that they're at risk. If you look at the clinical programs and the educational programs that we've developed, most of them say, don't you see you're at risk? Driving drunk is a bad idea. Driving and texting is a bad idea. These things are dangerous. You have to think like we do as adults. You have to really break down these situations. You're not invincible. We're all vulnerable. You have to think analytically like adults do. Let's talk about it. Let's plan it out. And so we've tried to give them sort of adult reasoning, and that's what our efforts have done. And the problem is that that's not based upon anything other than our good intentions, and it doesn't work. It results in programs like these. All these programs have either no data, or they make things worse, or in some iterations they can help a little bit, but not most of the time. DARE, the biggest health promotion program in the world, which is in about 75 or 80 countries, for the first 30 years made things worse. There's a few iterations now that are a little bit better, and they're helping kids to actually talk through some of this stuff and talk about how to manage drugs and alcohol. But absolutely, to be told that drugs are bad, drugs are bad, drugs are bad in 5th grade, 7th grade, 9th grade, and then to see your friend who's the captain of the swimming team who's getting straight A's, smoke weed, and be just fine, you thought, oh, those cops were full of crap. And it actually worked against the messaging they were giving you, and that's why we think it didn't work. Zero tolerance policies, miserable, right? The last thing you want to do with kids who are difficult is kick them out of school. They do not belong on the street or at home, they belong in school. We got to figure out a way to keep them. Scared straight programs, good idea, maybe, because we thought that fear would intimidate kids and they wouldn't want to go to prison, but in fact, it only empowered them to want to be in prison because those prisoners seem pretty cool when you go visit them. So none of these worked. A lot of how we teach driver's ed, now that we've done graduated driving programs, much better, and those are actually quite effective. And I imagine you have a graduated program here. Those are almost national now, and they're very good. A lot of how we teach sex ed, unfortunately, doesn't really do it. So we'll talk more about these things as we go. But when I ask you, when I suggest why adolescents overestimate risk, I like to show this little clip from Mean Girls. You can listen to what it says. Maybe you can.
I guess I'll never know what I missed on that first day of health class.
Don't have sex, because you will get pregnant and die. Don't have sex in the missionary position. Don't have sex standing up. Just don't do it. Promise? Okay, everybody take some rubbers. You're going to be having a lot of urges. You're going to want to take off your clothes and touch each other. But if you do touch each other, you will get chlamydia and die.
All right, so hard to hear. But basically what the coach is doing, and the coach is the sort of nominal, what did Woody Allen say? Those who couldn't teach taught Jim, and those who couldn't teach Jim taught at his school. So Coach Carr is actually, teaching the kids sex ed because he's been entrusted with this. You can see he clearly doesn't want to do it. He doesn't feel comfortable with it. This is not his domain. And he's speaking out of both sides of his mouth. Take some condoms, but, don't have sex because you'll die. And parents and schools have given some very heavy images and very heavy messages to our kids, and it has resulted in kids taking it seriously because kids go to us for information. So they think, yeah, driving drunk is really dangerous and I can die. And having unprotected sex results in pregnancy. So if you ask them again, when you ask your kids tonight, what the risk of pregnancy is from unprotected intercourse, they're going to tell you 95%, 99%, 100%. Telling them the real number, which is about 5%, doesn't make a difference. It's not going to make it better or worse. The fact is they already have inflated estimates, but that cognitive understanding is not going to dictate their behavior. They may think the risks are very high, but that doesn't affect their behavior. Let's talk about why. You remember Garrison Keillor's like Wobegon, all the women are strong, all the men are good looking, all the children are above average. Come to Manhattan, all the children are above average. Never been in a place where there's so many above average kids. Maybe here too, I don't know. But there is something called self-assessment bias. Think about yourselves now. I'd love to play this game with a big group. I won't do it to you tonight because we're going to be too, exposed. But if you think about, your marriage, and you think about whether you'll survive in your marriage, whether your marriage will last through the rest of your life, whether you get divorced, come up with a number, come up with a percent. What's the likelihood that you'll get divorced? Think for a moment about the age at which you're going to die. Not a very nice thing to think about, I know, but just imagine what age you think you'll be when you die. If you're a professor like me, you can say to yourself, is my work above average? So marriage, about 45% of first marriages in the United States end in divorce. It's higher in the UK and in Australia. About 65% of second marriages in the United States end in divorce. So if you're on a second marriage and you say you're definitely going to make it, well, okay, that's fine, but that's self-assessment bias. If you're on a first marriage, you're about 50-50. So you might make it, you might not. If you are a woman and you say in your mind that you're going to live past 81, or you're a man and you think you'll live past 76, that's self-assessment bias. Those are the average ages at which men and women die in our country. We all want to beat those numbers, but that's the average. If you're a professor and you think your work is above average, you're like 94% of professors who believe that their work is above average. So that's self-assessment bias, it's real. There's another thing when it comes to risk, and that's called optimistic bias. And this is the idea that even though I believe the risks are really high, I think I can somehow beat the odds. It's not invincibility. I believe that things are really bad, but somehow I can do things that other people don't think to do. I know how to drink enough water when I drink beer so I don't really get drunk. I know that coffee wakes me up and I'm a really good driver when I'm drunk because I roll down the window and put both hands on the wheel. I know, whatever it is. And that's called pluralistic ignorance, this idea that I think to do things that other people don't do. And that exists, and our adolescents absolutely have it. So that can get in the way. But it doesn't explain their risk-taking behavior, because in virtually every study we do, adults have just as much or more of this optimistic bias. Maybe it's because we've lived longer, so we think we know how to beat the odds. Maybe it's just self-preservation for humanity, hard to know, but we think that somehow we can beat the odds. So that is the optimistic bias, and that too doesn't explain why kids engage in risk. So why do they really engage in risk? These are the reasons. Their brains aren't fully cooked yet. They have every neuron, all billion neurons that they're going to have from the moment of birth, but there's a lot of growth to be had, a lot of connections, and they're working on those connections, and the connections are not yet full. So by the age of about 11 or 12, they can feel all of the huge emotions that people can feel in their whole lives: envy, disgust, rage, embarrassment, fear, love. Romeo, Juliet, she was 13. 100 words, 4 days, double suicide, out of love. Sounds like teenagers. So their emotional brain is intact. We call that the limbic system. But the frontal cortex, which controls that emotional brain, is not quite linked up yet. Now, we see that very clearly. The frontal lobes and the myelination grows in a linear way. It takes longer. The emotional brain goes really quickly. And we think it's for evolutionary purposes. They got to fall in love early as soon as they become reproductively viable so they can have babies and pass on the genes and keep the species going. How about reward? We all know about dopamine and dopamine's effect in the brain. And dopamine is at higher levels during adolescence than any other time of life. And dopamine is not really so much about reward specifically, but about what might be rewarding, what might feel good. And what might feel good is in our brains determines our viability. So for example, if you, I like to give the example of M&Ms. So if you have the first M&M you ever got in your life, piece of chocolate, and your parents are like, oh, try this is really nice, and you're like, okay, whatever, and you put it in your mouth, and it's not a good experience, it's an incredible experience. And so that chocolate really rocked your world. Something about that chocolate triggers a high dopamine response. Now, every time you see chocolate or M&M packages in the grocery store, which happen to be right by the checkout as you're leaving, your dopamine starts to flow, and you start to get excited about chocolate. You don't even need to get the chocolate. Actually, when you eat the chocolate, there's a small dopamine bump. It's the anticipation of the chocolate that drives that behavior. It's the anticipation of the sexual activity. The appetizer is always better than the dinner. Always. That gets you going. That's the dopamine. And then other receptors take over. So dopamine is higher than any other time of life. And dopamine drives us towards behavior. It's really not a reward as much as it is a learning or teaching neurochemical. Dopamine tells us to do things that are good for our survival. When your children found out that in order to have a baby, make a baby, a penis needs to go into a vagina, they probably were like, oh my God, you're kidding me. Like, there's no way. That is impossible. What are you thinking? No one would ever do that. My son, when he was like 6, he learned that. He said, I'm adopting. He's like, there's just no way. What world does that make sense in? How did you ever do that, Dad? That's insane. But you get to be older, and it's like, okay, this seems like curious. This is interesting. This might feel good. So what feels good changes our behavior, and that's what's happening during adolescence. Hormones. Lots of hormones are changing. Oxytocin, which allows us to bond. Everybody in the room who's gotten Pitocin during their pregnancy or during their delivery makes the uterus contract. It's artificial oxytocin. Makes the uterus contract. It also increases eye contact and engagement. And if I go over here and I stare at Amanda for about 2 minutes, and we sit here like this is about safe distance, and we just look at each other in the eyes. After about 2 minutes, we'll walk away. We don't know each other, and then a survey will be done the next day saying, what did you think about that experiment when you sat with that? And I'd say, I don't know, but I really liked her. Something about her was really cool. There's something, I don't know what it is, but there's something about her. When people look at each other closely in the eye, they start to connect. And dogs do it. Dogs actually have been with us about 20,000 years, and they have developed the mechanism because we benefit from our relationship, and we do it with dogs. So we bond with dogs. You know who doesn't do it? Cats. Because they've only been with us about 5,000 years. So they don't have that same linkage. Well, teens have higher levels of oxytocin than at any other time of life except for when they're actually delivering babies. So they get really high levels of oxytocin, which increases bonding and increases their engagement and their desire to be together. And we do a lot of other hormones like testosterone, which drives competition. Why are we competing with each other? It's not about being stronger. It's about being the most fit mate for the others who would potentially then want us to couple with them and make a family. That's what we think all this activity in our brain is doing around puberty. Early puberty, lights, melatonin drop. Puberty starts when melatonin drops. Some of the lights that we're giving our kids are actually probably promoting all this screen time, a little bit more puberty earlier. Also, all the foods that our kids are eating, which is resulting in kids being more overweight than ever before, more estrogen, more puberty, or early puberty. Early puberty means a longer period of time at risk when kids are cognitively unprepared for it. So a lot of things we're doing there. Peer effects, we know that when you put kids with their peers, they engage in more risk. When you take the peers away after the age of about 15, they won't engage in more risk. You put the kid next to them who is thinking about watching them or paying attention to them, or even just tell them a peer is watching them, and they will engage in more risk. But in a quiet environment where they have cold cognition, there's no pressures, they function more like adults. About a decade ago, we learned something really interesting. The brain is 3 pounds of neurons on a big body. It's got to be super efficient. There's only certain things you can do with the brain. So we have one set of heat receptors, and those receptors get triggered when we have warm, cozy feelings, just like when we have actually temperature increase in our skin. We have one set of brain pain receptors, and those same receptors trigger when we feel physical pain as when we feel emotional pain. And so if I ask you what the most painful experience in your life is, raise your hand if it was physical. Think about the most painful experience in your life, and if it was physical, which it is for a few % of people, but only a few, it's usually because they had chronic illnesses or chronic surgery or they've been in and out of treatment. But most people, it's emotional. It's the breakup. It's the divorce. It's the death of an animal or a parent. That's what really hurts. And when you're a teen, you feel social exclusion as pain. Pardon me. So what happens is kids are trying very hard, like all of us, not to feel pain. So if your friends are jumping off the bridge into the water, if your friends are smoking that new thing, if your friends are having sex, you don't want to be left out. You want to do that because it hurts not to do that. And when you ask your friend, hey, can we hang out tonight? And they're like, oh, God, I got too much homework, man. I'm sorry, I can't. And then you get on Snapchat later and you find out that they're hanging out at the mall and you weren't invited. That is painful. And that really hurts. One of the things we can do for that kind of emotional pain, whether it's breakups or whether it's not being invited to the mall, is to give our kids some Tylenol because it actually calms them down. It's actually effective because it helps emotional pain just like it helps physical pain. But it's not a long-term solution. In the short run, it is a reason that our kids engage in risk because they don't want to be left out. And then there's behavioral contributions, early school start times, caffeination, the drugs our kids use, not enough sleep, and not enough exercise, food that makes them feel bad, all this kind of stuff. So all that contributes. And the take-home point of this part of my discussion with you is that there is an enormous evolutionary advantage for our kids to be high-risk takers as adolescents. It has helped our species to survive and become what we have become. We've become what we become because Mother Nature has made our adolescents really strong, really capable of having a great immune response, of tolerating pain, of tolerating temperature extremes, and it's made them pretty gutsy so that they'll go out and try that new food source. They'll go out and find that new mating ground. They'll go out and find that new water source. They'll walk through the savannah at 120 degrees to see if they can, risk heat stroke, but see if they can find a new source of water or something like that. And they're the ones who are best suited for it, but we will lose thousands, although the species will ultimately survive and will save millions. So that's the evolutionary argument. It's why I called the book Born to be Wild. And the idea here is that the adolescent brain is not an accident. It's like a perfect evolutionary design built for risk. Because you wouldn't do most of the things I was just describing tonight. At least you wouldn't be so easily swayed, and you wouldn't want to do them. But for our kids, these things are immediately a consideration, even if they weren't a consideration 5 minutes ago. In the right environment, they can find themselves doing this stuff. So this is the end of the first part of what I wanted to say, and this basically should make us a little more empathic to our kids. Like, they're not purposely trying to anger us or purposely trying to get into risky behavior. Sometimes, yes, but because they're being driven to it. So let's understand we were there once ourselves, they're this way as well, and we have a lot to do to try to think about how to address their risk in a different way. I'll share this one slide with you as well. Just an analogy that might be helpful for you to think about kids' brains. You might think of a child's brain as a big, sort of palette, a big sort of dirt area with a couple of roads, but there's neurons, all the space is there that you need, all the billion neurons are there, but the connections aren't really well set up. By the time you hit adolescence, your brain looks like this. This is a portion of the LA freeway that looks really tangled, and you can get on and off all over the place with this road, but it's not very efficient because there's so much traffic because you can't move that many messages or that many cars in one spot in that road. And the adolescent brain is overly wired. And it's overly wired because when you're a kid, when you're a child, you don't know what your brain's going to be. And so the world has created us as being a very plastic or spongy brain. You can do all sorts of things. When I was born, I didn't know I'd be a doctor, nor did my parents. Maybe I was going to be a baseball player. Maybe I was going to be a gardener. Maybe I was going to be a mathematician. My brain didn't know either, so my brain had to be flexible. So based on the exposures I get, my brain starts to wire up and connect. And it looks like the adolescent brain there, which is a slower brain. It's a brain with lots of potential, but it's slower because there's so much traffic. By the time you hit adulthood, you've got fewer places to get on and off, but you've got much wider pathways. You've got much more enhanced roads, and you can move much more swiftly. In fact, the adult brain's about 3,000 times faster than the adolescent brain. It actually moves quicker. It just doesn't have as many options. It's built for you. So I love Heidegger's quote, every man is born as many men and dies as a single one, right? So that the potential could be anything. Substance use starts during these years. This curve is exactly what you see for every kind of substance ever. It peaks during late adolescence, early adulthood, and if you haven't tried weed by the time you're 26, there's almost no chance you're going to try it, or any other drugs that you haven't tried by now. There's a chance, and as we legalize marijuana everywhere, maybe you'll decide to try it. Oh, those gummies look kind of cute, but for the most part, you probably won't be getting into things you haven't been into before. So there's a big evolutionary advantage, and that's the argument of this. This is the paradox of adolescence. They're stronger, faster, more capable of managing risk and tolerating it and living through it, but they engage in it more. They die at much higher rates than ever before and after. Their death rates go up 200–300%, and youth is not wasted on the young. This is exactly what they're built for. Enter part 4. How do adolescents make decisions involving risk? So to walk you through this, I'll give you a scenario. This is John and Nancy, and they meet at a conference. And they don't know each other, they both have families, they're coming from out of town, they find each other attractive, and they're having a nice talk in the bar at the end of the evening, and they're kind of flirting and having some fun. This is Michael and Susan. And they are, come on, Michael and Susan, where's your name? There you go. And they're 17. And they meet at a party, and they're sharing a drink as well, or having a beer on somebody's porch somewhere. And they both have relationships with other people as well, but they're without their girlfriend, boyfriend tonight. So which couple of these two is more likely to have sex that night, do you think? They're both in relationships. Both couples have other relationships, but they're all having a drink and hanging out. Which couple is more likely to have sex that night? Michael and Susan, right? That's what most of us say, right? I always wonder in an audience, and it's a small audience again, so people are feeling probably a little, scared of saying something. But I always wonder when someone says John and Nancy, I always think, oh, yeah. But actually, that's not the question that I really care about. This question is just to get us sort of thinking about sex and kids and adults. The real question I want to ask you is which couple considers more information when they're making a decision about whether or not to engage in a relationship that night, to have sex? Which couple thinks about the decision more? They're all attracted to each other. Some of them are going to think about it more than others. Who's going to think more about it? Right? So the tendency is for us to think John and Nancy. Why, who said John and Nancy? Why did you say that?
Because they
So they've had more time in life, John and Nancy, to weigh pros and cons, to make responsible decisions. They know the consequences of these things. They've read plenty of books. They've seen plenty of movies. John's sister had an affair. It didn't work out very well. Nancy, you know, her boyfriend in college, who she was going to get married, had an affair with somebody, and she felt terrible and never want to do that to somebody, you know, all that stuff. But because they have that experience and because they have pretty hard, fast rules they live by, they actually think about it less. That's what you're missing. You think they think about it more, but they've thought about it more for years, so they don't need to think about it. For them, it's an automatic decision. Michael and Susan, they're 17. They know everything, but they really know nothing. And so they basically are in this position where they're like, well, I don't know. I mean, she looks attractive. He looks attractive. Would my girlfriend, boyfriend find out? I don't know. Would anybody know? I mean, is she interested in me? I don't know. I've never had an affair. I don't know. You know, does she have a condom? Do I have a condom? I don't know. Would we even have? I don't know. Did I even shower today? I don't remember. You know, there's so much going on in their heads that their decision making is all over the place. And when you play this game of decision making with young and old people around things, what you find, ironically, and this is called a developmental reversal, and this is also new information, what you find, even though it's easy to figure out, is that younger people think about novel situations more than older people. The less experience you have, the more you think about it. So the game I played with my daughter was I came home, she was 13, I said, honey, is it a good idea to eat a salad? Yes, Dad. Is it a good idea to exercise every day? Yes, Dad. Is it a good idea to get 8 hours sleep? Yes, Dad. Honey, is it a good idea? Oh, I actually like to start this story with my wife. I'm sorry, I told it backwards. So I say the same thing, it's the same questions, same answers. My wife says yes. And then I say to my wife, is it a good idea to swim with sharks? And she says, no. I say, is it a good idea to set your hair on fire? She says, no. I say, is it a good idea to drink Drano? She says, stop your stupid questions. Then I ask my 13-year-old the same questions, separate room. She says yes to all the first three, just like I told you. You know, everything, yes, of course, those are health decisions. It makes perfect sense. But when I ask the danger decisions, is it a good idea to swim with sharks? She stops and pauses. And she says, I don't know. I mean, what's it like? What kind of sharks? Are they big? Are they small? Do I have oxygen? Do I have a spear? Am I in a cage? Is it, you know, what is it like? Is it a good idea to set your hair on fire? All of my hair? Because that wouldn't be a good idea, but some of my hair, if I came to school tomorrow with like some fringes and it was burned, it would be something to talk about. It would be a story. Is it a good idea to drink a can of Drano? I don't know what Drano is. I don't know, Dad. So this is the picture here. Okay, but basically when it comes to any complicated decision that kids have never faced before, kids starting in middle school through high school and early adulthood think about it more. Remember their brain with all those roads all over the place? They're not efficient brains. So they ought to think about it and wonder about it and ask questions, and that's what happens. So this is important when we think about the next step, which is, you know, basically how we talk about risk with them, because we know that advanced decision makers, people who make really important decisions all the time, like every one of you who drives a car every day, the most dangerous thing you'll do your entire life is drive a car. You do it cavalierly, you go 70 miles an hour down the road, but you hit somebody with that 2-ton vehicle, they are going to die. And you might too. So we do it all the time. We don't think too much about it. So it becomes an automatic behavior. But these kind of people who do things like drive cars every day, they actually make decisions with a lot less information and faster. You don't sit and debate when you go into a curve, how much do I decelerate right now? Wait, do I shift up or down? What is it I do? How do I handle this? You know, I was telling Amanda earlier today, I could eat a burger, have a Coke between my legs, and drive a 5-speed around that corner. And I'm not thinking about that decision because I've done it so many times. It's just automatic. And people who do things a lot get really good at them. So newly minted medical students or doctors spend a lot more time thinking about novel medical situations. And they see a new patient and they've got 400 diagnoses in their head. And I see a new patient and I've got 3 in my head. Because I've seen thousands of patients. It's just practice. Same with triage nurses, same with police officers, firefighters going into buildings that are falling apart. You follow the experienced ones, not the young ones. You know, the young ones don't know what they're doing. They're going to walk right through the floor. You follow the ones who know what they're doing because they know what to look for. Can they tell you? Not even every time can they tell you what they're looking for, but they know it. And lots of work has been done looking at these kind of career people. The more experience you have, the better you do. This work started with pilots, and we know now very clearly that, again, experience after about a decade or two can make you expert in something, but you got to do it a lot. So that's advanced decision makers. This is a monk who was well known in Monterey, California. He was the first Zen Buddhist monk to come from Japan and set up a monastery in America, and he said a really beautiful quote, which gets to this point exactly. In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In the expert's mind, there are few. So the more expertise we have, the less we think about these complex decisions, but everything else about what you thought was right.
So my 17-year-old, I always call him a devil's advocate when I talk with him because he always is bringing up reasons why I'm not right. Is this part of why that experience happens, you think?
Maybe the question is for our viewers at home that when she talks to her 17-year-old, he acts as a devil's advocate. No matter what you're talking about, he asks a difficult question, maybe because his brain's trying to figure it out is what you're wondering. I don't know. I don't think we know. He may just be trying to get your goat. He may be trying to exert his independence. He may be trying to not feel the insecure identity questions he has, which is maybe I'm not as smart as mom. Wouldn't that be an insane thing if I'm not capable? So I better show her what I know and push back. All sorts of things might be at play here. And it may also just be that he's figuring things out. So what can we do differently? All right, so there are a couple of big principles about how we can help keep kids safe. The guiding principles are giving more information is not going to be more helpful. Information is fine. Information is currency, as they say, but they already have the belief that things are much more risky than they actually are. So just reminding them of that is okay. It doesn't hurt, and it lets them know you're thinking about them, but more teaching and more program efforts on the rates and the risks is not very helpful. So the things that really matter are to give them practice, and practice in lots of ways. Practice at being an adult. Practice at doing the things that adults do. If you look at driver's accidents, they've come way down with graduated driving licenses. That's a great way to think about practice. You start with a class. You get behind the wheel with an instructor. You get behind the wheel with your parents. You get a permit. You get a license, a limited license. You can have one kid in the car. You can drive during daylight hours. Then you can drive at night with only, et cetera, et cetera. But it takes, you get years. By the time you get an unlimited license in New York, you're 18, but you started driving at 15 and a half. That's 2.5 years of experience. That's incredible. I had my permit at 15. The day of my birthday, I had my license, and I was gone. And that's what it used to be, and that results in a lot more risk than what we have now. So practice really matters, whether it's decision making, whether it's driving, whether it's drinking, whatever it is, practice matters. And then emotional salience as well. That is being clear that these things can affect you, not just happen, but they can affect you and what that feels like, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. We also have to remember that adolescents aren't fully mature, so we want to support them and give structure and scaffolding where we can. Our efforts should encourage, when it comes to decision-making, automatic decisions. So pre-planned decisions in moments of risk. If there's going to be alcohol at the party, don't act like there's not going to be alcohol at the party. Plan for how they're going to handle the alcohol at the party. Do they get to go to the party? And there's good reason to let them go. There's some good reasons not to let them go. It depends on your kid and their age and all sorts of other factors, but if you let them go and they're going to be there, then there's going to be alcohol, and they may tell you they're not going to drink, but they're probably going to drink or be pressured to drink. So what does that look like? What decisions can we make in advance? When we let kids make pro and con decisions in the moment, there's a breakdown. So having a debate about whether I should do this or whether I should do that in the moment is very commonly resulting in a bad outcome. So shelter the young ones as much as we can, make efforts to modify the environment where we can, provide apprenticeships was the last bullet point there. So again, this kind of supported learning over time with scaffolding. When your kids are babies, you say it's cold outside, put on your jacket. When your kids are, well, maybe not babies, toddlers, 4 or 5. When they are 5 or 6, you're trying to help them be independent. You say it's cold outside, sweater or jacket. When they're 10, you say it's cold outside, remember to wear something warm. When they're 12, you just let them go out, and if they get freezing, then they remember to bring the jacket next time. But you don't keep babying them. You give them bit by bit by bit. You kind of open that up a little bit, and you give them an opportunity to make those choices. And at 12, they can freeze for a couple hours. They'll be okay. You don't have to give them your jacket, and they forgot, and that was on them. Natural consequences, but you gave them years of scaffolding to kind of get them to that point. So by 12, they probably won't forget their jacket. Or you might remind them, and they'll go, oh, yeah, right. So that's the way we got to do it. Now, there are parenting styles that work, and you may or may not have heard of these terms, like authoritative parenting. You guys, I think this is probably a high school, right? So high school sort of environment, so your kids are probably older. This is a great talk to give to parents when their kids are 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, because there's so much we can do at that age with kids The same lessons hold, but they are less powerful as kids age because they get more independent and more capable of walking off. But there's a whole science to parenting, what's called behavioral parenting, and there are things that we can teach in a way to parents, to parent, that make an enormous difference. There are some tasks and some skills. We call it behavioral parent training. I'll go over some of those components, I think, in a minute. Another concept is being around your kids. Monitoring and being around them really matters. You know, I was talking to a group today about reading time. We would sit with our kids after dinner every night and just have no devices. Nobody got devices, not mom, not dad. Everybody got a book or a magazine, sat on the couch for an hour with the dogs and read. And that was amazing. That was like really valuable time. We did it as long as we could. We maintained family dinners the rest of their time at home. Really helpful just to be around them, just to be available, just to be present. Makes a big difference. The more you know about your kids, the more they're going to talk to you. There's lots of misinformation about drugs and sex and all that stuff, and they're going to find it. It's online. It's all available. There's plenty of places to get information about sex and drugs and all the rest of it. A lot of it is false information or misinformation, so parents do well when they provide a good, safe place for kids to talk about this stuff, and they provide them with valuable information that they can share that's honest. We'll talk more about ways to do that. Limit screen time. There should be some limits, and we'll talk about that. I'll give you some ideas about that in a moment. Reframing reward, the way we do reward is very powerful to the brain. Remember, dopamine's higher than ever before. So some of the ways we can reframe reward for kids is to highlight their qualities of not engaging in risk. Like we can say, you can drive, you know, and you can take care of your friends. You remember John, he always drinks too much. So, you know, if you don't drink, you can drive and take care of your friend. That's a quality that kids admire. If you don't drink, or if you don't smoke weed, or if you don't do what you're not supposed to do, you don't have to lie to your parents, which for some kids is powerful because no kid really, I mean, most kids don't really want to lie to their parents. They will, and they'll do it, you know, when they need to, but they don't really want to lie to their parents if they don't have to. Providing safe risks like, you know, rock climbing, skateboarding, amusement parks, skydiving, whatever you're comfortable with. Those things are a turn on for kids. Authoritative parents practice a number of skills that are very valuable. We have studied authoritative parenting for now about 50, 60 years, since the mid-60s, when it was first identified as a technique or a style. It was contrasted to authoritarian, which is why, because I said so. Permissive, which is, you know, you sort of let your kids, oh, you know, bedtime's 9 or 9:30, they go to bed at 11, you're like, ah, it's okay. Negligent, there's not a bedtime anyway, you're just sort of not paying attention. And authoritative parenting is loving, kind, supportive, with very clear rules. Bedtime is 9 o'clock. Johnny gets to go to bed 9:30. Oh well, bedtime's 9 o'clock. Can I have a glass of water? 1 glass of water, bedtime's 9 o'clock. You know, you just keep the line. And we know that kids raised in this way become adolescents who have better grades, less anxiety and depression, higher self-esteem, more social competence, more self-reliance, lower rates of all the bad stuff. And they grow up into adults who have more satisfying jobs, who tend to stay married, who tend to graduate college, who tend to make more money, who tend to have fewer health problems. So there's a lot to this. The amygdala is the brain's threat hub. We see lower or smaller growth of the amygdala amongst kids who are raised with authoritative parents. So that's very clear. And the nucleus accumbens, the reward center, is less active, less hot amongst kids who are raised this way. Now, is it going to work for every kid? No, this won't do it alone. But for a kid who is your typical kid, whose brain is typical, this will be very powerful for them. These are skills that you can teach in about, you know, 8 or 10 hours. We could be teaching this stuff in school. The techniques are positive reinforcement, effective commands, selective ignoring, scheduling, reward programs, and then limit setting and consequences and timeouts. Basically, there's much more on the positive than the negative. You get a lot more bees with honey than vinegar. There's lots of great techniques, lots of great ways to teach this, and I think this would be valuable to bring into, it's basic behavior modification, but as applied to kids. I think you could bring this in the high schools, actually, and teach this kind of stuff. Enhanced supervision, what does that look like? As I said already, the more parents know about their lives, the fewer risks kids take, the more they see their parents as trustworthy, the more they seek them out for advice. And in addition to sort of being an available parent and having more time at home with your kids, another thing we can do is enhance after-school programs. They really do work. And the Youth in Iceland is one example of an amazing program. But essentially, by requiring kids to be in after school for a few hours, you increase the likelihood that they will do their homework, you increase the likelihood that they'll have positive pro-social relationships, you increase the likelihood that they'll get involved in hobbies that they care about and are motivated by, sports, music, theater, all the rest of it, and you decrease the likelihood that they'll hang out the mall and get into trouble.
How honest with your kids should you be about the risks you took, and at what age, how is that appropriate?
That's a great question. How honest should you be with your kids about what you did? Which tells me something about you. That's up to you. And there's no right or wrong, and there's no studies on that. So what you don't want to do is glorify risk. You don't want to, like, my kids didn't see that picture of me drinking the beers until like 2 years ago. And by then they were over 20. So, you know, it was when I saw my picture of my son sitting on the thing that I said, oh my God, that's so funny. You know what? I got this picture, you know, and then I showed it to him. But that's not the kind of thing, because you don't want to glorify it and make it sexy and appealing. You know they're going to do it. They're going to ask you, Mom, did you ever smoke weed? Dad, did you ever whatever? And we don't know that there's a right or wrong answer to that. I mean, in the framing that you have, in the way that you want your kids to understand and to be, I think there's value in both, potentially. You can say what is the truth. You can frame it however you want. You can also say, I don't want to tell you that. And your kids may not like that. You're my best friend, Mom. No, I'm not your best friend. I'm your mom. It's better. It's different, and it's better. I'm not your best friend. And, you know, that's a message that kids also need to learn a little bit. You know, we're not really friends until they're married with investments, you know. We're friends before then. I mean, we're after then, I'm sorry. We're parents before then. You know, we're there to coach them and support them and love them and take the hard hits with them. Friends aren't going to stand by you like the way I'm going to stand by you. You know, they're fair weather. You know, I'm going to be there to pull your hair back when you're vomiting in the toilet. You know, that's a different thing. So I think that you can say, you know, I don't want to talk about that with you. I'll tell you later when you're older. That's fine too. Screen time. I have a picture of a toilet here because it turns out that there's 7 billion people in the world, and a couple of years ago, the World Health Organization told us that of the 7 billion people in the world, 6 billion have access to a smartphone, but only 4.5 billion have access to a sanitary place to go to the bathroom. And that can be a pit in the ground or a toilet. So we have more communication than we have sanitation in this world. These statistics, you can read about these things anywhere, the book, any website you like, so I'll go through them quickly. But basically what you need to know is that kids have an enormous access to media, which you already know, and that it is not benign. It is not innocuous. There are advantages to it. It allows us to communicate. We're never going back. It's okay, but we got to learn to deal with it. Aristotle said all things in moderation. We're not handling moderation here very well so far. When you look at studies of screen time in kids who have excessive screen time, what you find is their brains are smaller. You find that they have trouble with decision making. You find they have higher rates of depression, higher rates of obesity. They read later. They find reading less attractive, all sorts of things. And even when a cell phone is present, so if we're having a meal and you have your cell phone on the table, or it's a place where I can see it, I am going to tell you, or I'm going to tell whoever asks me, that you're not a very good listener, that you're not empathic to me, simply because your phone is present. It's sort of like anywhere but here, I guess. If something better comes along, it's like what happened when I lived in my 20s in LA. You could make plans with someone and it was great, but if something better came along, they were out. Because everybody wanted to be an actor. You know, everybody wanted that part, whatever it was. I might meet the person who's going to get me there. When you know, that was the big joke in Los Angeles back in my 20s, in the 80s and 90s. You know, that like you just, you have plans until you don't have plans. But that's what a cell phone does to people. So, all right. This is some data from the CDC. Look at this. This is the amount of time our kids are spending on screens outside of school-mandated screen time and homework. So 8 to 10, 6 hours a day, 4 hours on TV. 11 to 14, 9 hours a day, 5 hours on television. 7.5 hours a day for teenagers, 4.5 on... What the hell else are they doing all day long? Where is their time going? This is half of their day or more. They are on a screen. They got to sleep for a few hours at least. They do a little bit of homework. They get some screens in school in addition to this. It is a remarkable amount of time. So we've just like coughed over our entire childhood to Facebook and Instagram and Stephen Jobs. Yeah.
I wondered when you were talking about the oxytocin and you were getting the face-to-face time with Amanda.
Yeah, that was so nice. I really like her. There's something about her.
If you were looking at a screen and FaceTiming a person, or if you're talking to a teacher, do you still get that oxytocin?
We don't know. Like on a screen, you're saying? We don't know. I have, or at least I haven't seen anything about that. I suspect there's not. That's pretty new. But this idea of screen times is important, and we're seeing a lot. And there's value to screens, of course, and we can do amazing things. You know, Eric has a job because of screens. You know, he's the tech guy here tonight. And many of us have jobs because of screens, or in part because of screens, but they can't be the only way that we learn to function, and we're getting a little too into it. So this is a really interesting slide. This is home media ecology. This is the products in the first column, from where we got media when I was 12 years of age in 1975, how they got into my house, where they were displayed, and where they were stored, right? My house or any house in 1975. This is what it looks like today. There's a lot more ways to get it. There's a lot more ways to get into the home. There's a lot more ways to display it, and there's a lot more places to store it. And so we're getting a huge amount of exposure. It's just another really interesting way of looking at how the media is constantly bombarding our kids and ourselves. And it's easy to get out of it. So this is, I say, why God created the fruit bowl. So you put your phones in it when you come home from school, that you store them there during meal times, that you limit your kids' access. There's a group called Wait Until 8th, which, you know, there's no reason an 8th grader needs a cell phone, but okay, at least 8th, but you could wait as long as you possibly can. I think parents need to bond together on this, because I think what happens is a lot of the kids get phones, and then every other parent's like, well, I don't want to be the bad parent. I got to give them a phone too. But every parent kicking themselves, saying, why the hell am I paying $60 a month for this kid to have a phone for the next 2 or 3 years or 10 years or whatever it is? Why am I doing that exactly? You know, if they only need to contact me, well, so many kids have a phone, they can call me, or they can go to the school office and call me, or they can do what I did and just come home when I was a kid. And by the way, abductions and you know, children getting kidnapped happens so much less now than it did when you were growing up. It's a big thing in the 70s. Not a big thing now. Hardly ever happens. Don't kid yourself that the phones are about safety. It's about being beaten into it by corporations and by other kids and other kids' parents and all the rest of it. So postpone the phone as long as you can. Friend your kids on social media. You own the phone. When you give them the phone, you say, this is my phone. You get to call it your phone, because that's how we do it in this house. But this is my phone. I pay the bill. You can't even own this phone legally until you're 18. And when you're 18, you're not going to have enough money to pay for this phone. So this is my phone, but you can, or mine and mom's phone, you can use it. It's your phone to play with and to enjoy under the regulations that we've set up. It is a privilege, it is not a right. And I want you to sign right here so that you understand these rules and regulations. And you say it nicer than I'm saying it now. But that's the gist. You know, you give them a contract. You say, this is the way it's going to be. Because otherwise, it becomes something they own now. And it becomes something that is something you're going to fight about. So I'm trying to remember the statistic. I just read it recently about parents. But it's something like 25% of parents say that they fight about the phone every day with their kids. Every day. And that the majority of parents fight at least like 3 times a week about the phone. It's like, we didn't have phones before. You know, we fought about the phone. It's like, get off the phone so I can call so-and-so. You remember you were a teenager, you were on the phone for a long time, and, you know, parents would pick up, get off the phone, Mom! You know, that's a whole different thing. Think about limitations, when kids can talk on the phone, keep screens as long as you can in shared spaces, because the nicest of kids will do the nastiest of things on screens. Always keep supervision around kids. If they have to be in their bedrooms, then keep the doors open as long as you can. Stop screens before bed. If kids are using screens at night, put on some of these blue light blocking devices. They do make a difference, and it helps kids to sleep better. More things we can do. We can teach media literacy, which I'm always pushing for in schools and at home. Kids in teenage years are very interested in pushing back against the man, right? They don't want to be told what to do. They don't want you to tell them what to do. But yet these corporations, these big corporations, are always telling them what to do, but they think it's cool. So they don't get that the corporations are the worst form of the man, but you need to teach them that these corporations are manipulating them. So we can try to show healthier models. Here's a picture I often show. This is George Clooney with his business partner, and they made this tequila brand, and they're driving through the agave fields with no helmets in their motorcycles and having some tequila, and it looks really cool. And I showed this ad to my 15-year-old. I caught this on a big truck that went by my home on LaGuardia and Houston Street, and I took a picture and I showed it to my son. I said, what do you think of these guys? He was 15. He said, they look so cool. I said, why? He's like, oh, they're riding motorcycles with no helmet, they're drinking tequila. And I'm like, yeah. Like George Clooney, who's married to a civil rights lawyer, is advertising driving a motorcycle without a helmet and drinking. What the hell's the matter with him? So you want to teach people, I think our kids, to read ads. Here's a nice ad. A bunch of black people who look like really handsome and beautiful, and they're on a roller coaster, and it looks great, and they're having a good time, and they're in the peak of health Forget about the cigarettes in the corner. Okay, there's cigarettes there. This ad wouldn't be so egregious if it weren't for the fact that we disproportionately advertise cigarettes in black neighborhoods, because black neighborhoods are more often than white neighborhoods impoverished neighborhoods. And people who are impoverished go to substances to help calm some of their nerves, like alcohol and drugs and tobacco and fast food, and we put that stuff in these neighborhoods disproportionately. Let kids understand, teach them how much this happens. Everybody's interested in mental health? Well, half of all cigarettes are sold to people with chronic mental illness, like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. These companies are making millions off of the most vulnerable in our population. I think our kids deserve to know this, and I think it's powerful for them. Cigarette use was going down until e-cigarettes. We finally got hold of this. We wrangled the tobacco companies. We put advertising and pictures of diseased lungs, and there's people on the news. A 55-year-old woman on the TV today said, this is what happens when you smoke, and her face is falling apart. You know, she's had terrible difficulties, and this is the kind of thing that actually made an impression on people. It really impacted kids, and then vaping came about. And now it's all over the place. And our kids are vaping, and the numbers are going up. The risk is going up. This is a Juul ad, a series of Juul ads, and they make it really cool. Who are they targeting? Absolutely targeting teenagers, right? Get them hooked. Look how cool it is. She's got it in her mouth. Oh, devil may care. Look at her. She's like, oh, it's so fun. I'm addicted to nicotine. It's great. You know, he's got this thing on his eyes. Like, what is that? Well, what you find is that these things are often based upon ads that are popular, and people are popular. This is Ariana Grande, very popular singer. Look at her pose, classic haircut, and look at the Juul ad. Just exactly positioned on the way she tends to look. So there's a whole bunch of manipulation going on that our kids are barely aware of. When Juuls came out, the whole argument was these things are safe, which we don't know if they are, and they are designed to help people get off tobacco. But look who uses them. 15 to 17-year-olds are 16 times more likely to use them than people in their 20s. I don't have to teach you what this is about, but you know, this is an alcohol ad, and this is basically suggesting, you know, barely subliminally, that if you drink this stuff, good things will happen to you sexually. Smart may have the brains, but stupid has the balls, you know. Oh, that's something to admire. Thirsty, come inside. The BK Super 7-incher is coming up. No, I took that one out. Okay, so, but the point is that ads are manipulative, they're sexualized, they're doing the kind of things that we say and profess to not want our kids to have to deal with. So this is a concern and something that we need to pay attention to. When we talk about cognitive strategies, we can acknowledge that the risk is low. If they understand the risk is low, if kids understand that the numbers are low, but that the consequence is pretty severe. Once is all it takes. The message is not don't overdo it. Don't overdo it is bedtime's 9 or 9:30, which means it's 10 o'clock. You know, don't overdo it means I can have 3 beers or 7. But, you know, once is all it takes is one-time unprotected intercourse is all it takes to get pregnant. All it takes to get chlamydia. All it takes to get whatever. Yeah, it's true. If they know the numbers, it's not usually going to happen, but it's the risk. Analogies. Moving kids away from deliberate calculation and understanding that there's a real sort of a go, no-go process here. Would you play Russian roulette for $1 million? You know, that's one way to frame, would you drive drunk? Would you have 3 beers and drive? Would you play Russian roulette? You know, trying to put it in a way that our kids can move away from thinking about it bit by bit by bit and going to the big picture. More things we can do. I mentioned earlier that having an emotional or personal cue is important. So what would happen if you got pregnant? I have this conversation with patients all the time. What would happen if you got pregnant? I won't get pregnant. Why won't you get pregnant? Well, we almost always use birth control. Almost always? Well, yeah, almost always. Well, what if you got pregnant? Well, I won't get pregnant. What if you got pregnant? Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. Would you have the baby? Would you stay in school? Would you go to prom? Would you have an abortion? Like, what would happen? What would that be like for you? And that is a way to get this sort of feeling of real potential into a kid's head. So there's lots of ways to do this. Conversation, discussion, you know, have kids in a classroom saying, what would you do if you got pregnant? Write it down on a piece of paper, throw it in the bowl. You know, people then read the papers and they go through these discussions, and you have these very meaningful discussions that might help them to make some better decisions. Red alerts is another thing. Identifying what the red alerts are. The example I give here is home alone after school with your boyfriend. But there could be lots of red alerts. Driving with a friend who's particularly dangerous, or going to a party and without having a designated driver. Whatever the red alerts are, understanding what those are and talking about those in advance. Teaching kids and this is where the new iterations of DARE have been a little bit better. They're starting to give kids some actual skills to use. What do you do when someone offers you that third beer or says, smoke this, don't be a wuss, you know? How do you talk about that? What do you say? What can you say? So practicing that is important as well. There's more things we can do. You're allowed as an adult, as a mom or dad, not to let your kids drink, but to drink. That's fine. That's the law. But if you don't want your kids to drink a lot, then don't drink a lot in front of them, because they learn by what we do. You don't want them to smoke? Don't smoke. You don't want them to smoke weed? Don't smoke weed. Use frequent reminders. That's fine to remind them. Map your decision pathways in advance. This is this idea we were talking about earlier. At moments of cold cognition, when there's no pressure, there's no peers, go through it piece by piece. What are you going to do? Then what? Then what do you do? So that they have the gist, as we say. They already have an automatic decision planned. Teach emotion self-regulation. Lots we can do in schools here. This is the mindfulness, the acceptance, the breathing, the calming. When do you feel something? How do you know you're feeling it? And knowing that those feelings often predict thoughts that result in behavior. That's sort of a cognitive behavior model. Social norms marketing is what we've learned is that kids believe that they are taking fewer risks than their friends. They actually believe that their friends are taking many more risks on average, and so that drives them to risk-taking. So you can actually show them that actually, no, not as many people are smoking or having sex as you think. Yes, the numbers are high, but they're probably lower than you think, so you're not being so left out. And that's shown some benefit. Use ratios, not percents. Percents, even the most skilled of us at math, don't really get 5% and 7%, so 1 in 5, 1 in 10 is usually a better way to talk about these things. There's lots more we can do. I've been talking to your school about this today and tomorrow as well, limiting phones in schools, getting back to exercise, sleep, and nutrition, school start times and after-school programming, teaching resilience via neuroscience in schools. There's all sorts of skills to teach. School-based mental health clinics, which I understand you have in this county, which are terrific. They make a big difference. Sex education and actually making condoms available. I just want to make a pitch for condoms. I don't own stock in Trojan, but I just want to tell you that when you make condoms available, kids have no more sex than they were having before. They don't have more sex when condoms are available. Studies from the US, Canada, all over the UK, New Zealand, Australia, show that when you have condoms available, kids who are having sex already are more likely to use a condom. So making condoms available in school is not condoning sex. It's just saying that if you've made this decision, we hope you'll do it safely. I know that seems not wise to some parents' ears. I don't know where you all sit or where your colleagues sit, but this is something we really have to work against. New York City schools must have condoms in them. We don't have more sex than we used to have. What we have is more kids using condoms if they're having sex. Yeah.
I get what you're saying. Where do they make them available?
Yes, right. Where do they make them available? Yeah.
At the school.
Yeah, at the school. So you can find them, you can go to the health educator or the counselor office and you can always get them there, but that means you have to go in and say, can I have some condoms, please? Right? The other thing they do is they put them on the door of that and they put them in like a brown envelope, a manila envelope, and everybody knows they're there, so people can just go by and grab them. And that's a place, that's how most schools do it. Yeah, you're welcome. Do you want to say anything else about condoms? No, just that just that colleges do the same thing. More and more colleges do it. It's just, the analogy I was gonna tell the story. For those of you who've worked in mental health, you know that in the 1970s, it was taboo to ask about suicide. Don't ask about suicide, people will want to commit suicide. This is the same sort of thing, it's just the modern version of it. Asking about suicide is amazing to do because everybody thinks about it, and those who are really struggling with it now feel like they can talk to you about it. So it's one of the things we must do. I think the same way. There's some things at societal level too, but we're not going to touch those things. This is the book. That's my music. I do music online, so you can find my music if you want to listen to rock and roll. All right, I'll go back to this, and I will thank you for your attention, and all 7 of you and a half. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it, and I'm happy to talk more, or answer questions, or hear what you have to say. Please.
Maybe this is a little contradictory to what you were talking about, but what do you do for children who are afraid to take risks because they see these high, or they have imagined these high, probabilities of something happening, so now they're afraid to drive or afraid to go out after COVID and take their mask off
So that's an interesting question. The question is, what do we do with kids who are afraid to take risks for whatever reason? Because of what they've heard, or there's been COVID. I've actually been dealing with a couple of kids in the clinic who are afraid to take their mask off, afraid to go to school. And we've treated these kids for anxiety because it's been the first expression of what is probably a brewing anxiety disorder anyway. Now, whether it would have happened with COVID or without COVID, I don't know. But it's a good question. So not taking risk isn't a terrible thing, but taking a little risk is normal and typical. And you have these kids, like I have a niece who was very risk averse, and she was very anxious. You know, she didn't want to have overnights, she didn't want to go to camp, and she didn't want to take risk. And she's doing beautifully now. She was a late bloomer. So I think support, understanding, encouragement, it's okay, and taking some risk with her. Driving, I think, is an important thing to learn in this world. If you're living in a place like Ohio, you need to, in New York City, half the kids never learn to drive. But here, you need to learn to drive, probably, to function at your peak. So I think getting behind the wheel with them and giving them practice, start slow, you know, go low, and just do what you can do.
Push them out of their comfort zone?
Yeah, a little nudge is fine. My sister used to say to my niece, go smoke some weed. I'm like, Karen, I'm not sure that's the message. But, you know, because she knew her kid was such a good kid, she wanted her to do something to like sort of break out of that a little bit. And it took her a while, but she eventually did, you know, just touch her toe in a little bit of that risk, get drunk a few times, or make out with a few guys she didn't know, and then that was enough for her. That's all it took. She back on the straight and narrow, but you know, that's just how she's built, and people are built differently. So I think that's fine. I think that's fine.
I have a question from someone watching online. Can you discuss how to slowly introduce alcohol with teenagers?
Yeah.
Or what is that? How do you teach to drink?
Yeah.
We talked a little bit about this earlier, and I'd love your feedback on it.
So this is something I can't give you a hard and fast tool or method, because this is something we have acted like it doesn't really exist. We haven't really studied this. We're like, well, you shouldn't drink until you're 21, and then 21, it's like, yahoo, you know, the cuffs are off and go do what you want. And that's a problem, because people don't learn to drink. And different families do it differently. You have your way, I have my way. You know, I can't tell you a scientifically valid way to teach people to drink. Generally speaking, when parents are able to teach high-risk behavior, it can be a great thing. But you have to teach it in moderation. You know, how do you manage that? What are the lessons you give? And I can only tell you what I've done or what patients do, but I think that talking about is the most important thing. Not acting like it's not out there, being really clear with kids, and maybe having that conversation. We know a bunch of things. We do know, for example, that from the brain perspective, adolescents and young adults feel much less hangover, and the alcohol effects have much less of a lasting effect on them the next day or that night even. They even feel less drunk with the same amount. Like, I might have 2 beers and feel tipsy. They might have 2 beers and feel nothing. But the neurotoxic effects to a developing brain are much greater. So the effects of alcohol and marijuana and other things are more severe on a young person's brain than they are on an older person's brain. Remember, they're more plastic, so there's more growth, there's more reorganization. So regular use is a problem. Periodic use, hard to know. Teaching them, very difficult. You figure it out. You know, my parents did it with me in sort of in a funny way. Thankfully, I don't have an alcohol problem. But they just basically, when we were kids, if there was wine at dinner, starting around double digits, they would say, do you want a half an inch or something like that of wine? And so we learned to drink in a way that didn't seem like a big deal. And then when we were maybe in high school, we could have an inch of wine. And maybe by the time we were 18, we could have a glass of wine. But 1 glass. It wasn't more than a glass. And it wasn't every night. It was like, you know, a night or 2 a week. And on Sunday, we'd have a beer or share a beer, you know, kind of thing. And that's how my parents did it, and I never felt like it was taboo or a big thing. And that was helpful for me, although I did sometimes imbibe, you know, with friends and things like that. It was never like something I could, like for a lot of my friends, it was like they could never get their hands on it. They were so dying to get their hands on it. But we don't know, you know, teaching them the techniques of like 1 beer, 1 water, you know. What's the amount you're going to drink at this party? What are you going to have tonight? And practice those things. We don't know. I wish I could tell you a good method.
Have the conversation more about, I know this is it's not a question of if there's going to be alcohol at a party you go to, but like which party it's going to happen at, right?
Yeah.
And so some of it is even just having the discussion about, so I know it's going to happen, and so let's talk about now how we might think about it, or as opposed to, you know, just the head in the sand, just don't do it, and you know how trouble you're going to be in, and then, yeah, hiding it or not hiding it well, and then, it's like a whole thing.
I agree with everything you said, which is all very sensible, and having the conversation being the most important thing, and having a plan in advance. You're going to a party. Is there going to be alcohol? No. Well, come on. I wasn't born yesterday. There's probably going to be alcohol. Let's talk about how you're going to handle it. Designated driver. I'll come pick you up. No questions asked. All those kind of things that parents are trying. And most kids will handle it well, and that's the issue. Most kids will negotiate this okay. They may get drunk, they may regret their behavior, but most won't have a problem. But, I deal with a lot of those people who do have those problems, and we hit it really hard. When we start to see some slippage, then we get then we're all over it. If you're smoking weed and you're a teenager and I'm your parent and I don't know it, it's not a problem, as long as I'm an intact, connected parent, because it's happening out of my purview. Your grades are still good, your friends are still good, your clubs are still good. I'm not encouraging it, but I'm unaware of it, so probably it's not a problem. But as it starts to become a problem, as you start to see slippage, as you start to anticipate that, then you're on it 110%. Then there's drug testing, and because now it's going down the wrong way. And we would like to get on it sooner, but some parents don't know. How do you get on it sooner? Conversation, keep them active, keep them engaged, all that scaffolding, all that other stuff we're talking about. Because you won't know when they start doing it if they have lots of time away from you and away from adult supervision. Kids go before puberty from having about 8% of their time unsupervised to more than 30% after puberty by adults. So there's just a lot of time when they're on their own and they can get in mischief.
What are we still learning about the human brain?
Everything we're learning about the human brain. There's so much. I mean, the question is, what are we still learning about the human brain? Tons. And we're learning all the time. We still don't biopsy the brain, right? We still don't really take the cells out and look at them, except for in animals, and that sounds terrible. We have imaging tools, and we take pictures, and we can learn a lot with pictures, so much more than we could before. But the Human Genome Project, which began in the 90s or 80s, and we finished a decade ago, we thought it'd have all the answers, and all we learned was that there's a lot of genes, and there's a lot of genes that don't seem to do anything, and there's a lot of genes that can get turned on and turned off. And we've learned that exposures and your experience can make certain genes active and other genes quiet. And that's been a big learning tool for us. And we've learned about things like copy number variations, how sometimes a gene makes too many copies of itself or too few copies, and that results in some sort of mutation. We've realized that the genome is much more diverse than we ever understood, but all the hopes that we would find single genes responsible for all these problems didn't come through. And I think the brain's in a similar place. We're getting a good sense of how it works, but we still consider it, to our understanding, the most complex thing in the universe. So we got a long way to go.
In your book, you talk about the doubling of information. When does that stop, or how do we keep up with that?
Yeah, we don't. The information doubling, which was talked about maybe 30, 40, 50 years ago, but the idea that it doubled sort of about every, it doubled sometime between the Middle Ages and the 1900s, and then it doubled about 100 years, and now we think that information is doubling so quickly, it's about every year that information is doubling. And we're putting so much out there. And I can tell you, as a physician who's trying to treat patients, I am often doing literature searches for, is there a new treatment, or is there a new version of this, or a new understanding, or what happens when you go. I'm facing a rewrite of my first book, the third edition now of its textbook. It's like, why did I say yes to this? Because the amount of papers I have to go through to look at, it's only been 8 years since the last edition, but how much has changed? It's impossible. If we're doubling every year, then there's 8 times more information than there was, or even more than that. So it's incredible. You do what you can. The good news is there's good search engines for looking things up, not just Google, but many others that are specific. And you can do quick reviews, and there's a lot of ways to do keyword searches when you're looking for things. I don't mean just my kind of work, but when you're looking for stuff. And we have access that we never had before. I mean, when I was to write a paper in high school, I used to go to the newspaper and look at the microfiche and pull out the old articles to find stuff. Now it's a keystroke. And so I think there's an advantage to it, but it's overwhelming. It probably won't stop. It'll probably just keep speeding up.
So how do we help our kids filter how much they need to know about one particular thing, or should they, be the sort of trivial pursuit masters?
how do we help our kids know how much they need to know? I think it varies on what it is they're learning. When they're writing a paper, or when they're doing some work, there's a certain amount of background they need, and maybe getting too deeply in the weeds, you could chase things down a lot of different directions. I think it depends on what your need is. No one's going to know everything. You have to settle in at some point on where you're comfortable. I don't think I have any great words of wisdom on how much you need to know. But there's a lot of information out there, and I think you can easily get overwhelmed with it. And I think that people who are particularly compulsive can get stuck and can lose the forest for the trees. So I encourage people not to get too much bogged down in the detail. But the risk of this is that, and I see this as, I teach college as well, and I see this, that a lot of kids write a paper based on things they've seen online, and so they just copy large swaths of information from websites, and that kind of is a danger to original thinking. So I think we have to help kids with that a great deal. And I think we can do that in high school, because they get to college, and I can tell you, even as such a fine institution as NYU, a lot of these kids are plagiarizing. And we use software to see if it matches up, right? Turn it in or something. And these kids, they don't understand that when you copy 2 pages directly from a website and put it in your paper, that's not original work. So they need help with that. And they need to learn that in high school, because in college it matters. You get kicked out of school. Stuff happens. You get an F, whatever, it's a big deal.
Speaking of kids going off to school, we've got one that's graduating and going off to school, most likely,
Yeah.
this next fall. And he's had some challenges with, last week we've seen some good turnaround and things like that. But he's ADHD, he's had depression, and has had suicidal thoughts as well, unfortunately. Any advice to parents that have had a little bit of a rockier road? And I love the idea of gap year, but my son doesn't like that at all.
Yeah.
Highly intelligent.
Mm-hmm.
Any advice on
Yeah, tons of thoughts about a child who's got ADHD, who's struggled with depression, who's had suicidal thinking at times, who's had a rocky start. The good news is that doesn't have to predict his future, right? That there's so much we can do. So the first thing I would want to make sure you're doing is that you've got a good treatment team for him set up here, so that he's got a good therapist. If he's on medication, he's got a good psychiatrist, someone he can connect to, someone you can connect to and get support from. Secondly, I think that if he's had that many struggles, staying close to home for school is probably a good idea. So you say a gap year because you want him to have another year to mature, and you want him to be more prepared, and another year will help him mature if that gap year is valuable for him. So if that gap year is something he cares about, is constructive, he's learning something, does a job, makes money for school, feels good about himself, great. If the gap year is selling Cutco knives for 3 months, and then going off and working in a cafe for 2 weeks, and then doing nothing for 6 months, that's terrible. So it's about whether he wants to do it, and can you actually, yeah. So then I think generally closer to home is probably helpful. Very important to work with his treatment team in advance of him going off to school, to identify either practitioners there or to stay online, but to keep it connected and going. Don't change anything in the treatment that's working for the first semester at school. Kids go off to college often and they're like, I'm not going to be that ADHD kid. I'm not going to be that kid who took those medicines. My parents used to take me to that dumb doctor. I'm not going to that guy Shatkin again. Forget it. I'm going to do my own thing. And they get there and they stop all their medicines, and 2 weeks later they're in the emergency room. And then they've lost the first semester, and then they have no friends, and it's terrible. So that's a big part of the transition, and we work really hard with them there. I think recognizing that going off to college is an enormous stress. And it's great, but it's an enormous stressor. So what can you do to anticipate that? That's why I think sort of closer to home, a place with supports, where his friends going, activities, engagement. You go there early, you tour the campus a lot, you get to know the place, it becomes familiar, you go have lunch there. He gets to really know you. Visit him frequently. Those are the kind of touch points that we look for. There's whispering. I think we might be over.
I think
Are we done?
wanted to check in to see if we had
Okay.
anyone else's, any other questions, right? Like, I want to be mindful of everyone's time. But this was fantastic. Any other final questions? Feel free to